and welcome to this second episode in our influence series of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And as you join us this week, this is the second in what we hadn't necessarily planned, but has turned out to be a two-part influencers episode about Donald J. Trump. And in the first episode, the first thing we did was we tried to talk about how we were going to attempt to be unbiased. And then for the next hour, we agonized as we tried to sort of steer clear of our bias. But hopefully, if you haven't listened to it, please do go back and listen to it, because we talk about Donald Trump's early life, and we can't help ourselves but dive into some interesting questions around tenacity, around why is he like the way he is. And when you join us today, we're going to start off by talking about his brand. Before I start off, though, Gareth, I gave you literally, we explained at the end of last episode, we were going to record this back to back. I literally gave you minutes to think about some of those things. And in fact, I left you with a question. Maybe we'll start with that as a way to lead us in. I said, we have done episodes on a Mr. Machiavelli and a von Clausewitz chap, both who talk in terms of strategy and in terms of how to achieve your goals with virtue. What do you think Mr. Machiavelli and von Clausewitz would say about Donald Trump?
Well, I think the easy one is Clausewitz. I think Clausewitz is perhaps most famous for his comments around the linkages or the overlaps between policy and war, and the fact that you cannot disentangle these two things. And so I think he would probably be fairly disparaging of a leader who doesn't take international relations that seriously, and therefore increases, often deliberately, the tensions between states, and uses the threat of force, not in terms of developing the national strategy, but in terms of winning tactically in the here and now. And I think he would probably pick on that and say that that is a really good example of why Donald Trump is not a particularly good geopolitical strategist. And we talked last week about the fact that he is probably a very good strategist if his end goal is all about, the notoriety, the success, the headlines are about him. So he is narcissistically a brilliant strategist. I think Clausewitz would be very disparaging of him. Machiavelli, I think, is slightly harder. And I think it depends on which side of the fence you sit on in believing whether the things that he does are going to achieve great things for the people that he represents, the American people. So I think there's a very, very good argument for somebody who is a left of centre leaning Democrat to say Machiavelli would absolutely abhor Donald Trump, because although Machiavelli says it's absolutely okay because the ends justify the means, it's all about virtue. It's all about achieving the ends to create better success for the nation state, for the people you represent. And I think Democrats would very clearly point to how they don't believe that that is going to happen, and they believe that it's all about the world of Donald Trump, and he is actually sacrificing things like national security. I think equally, though, there are people on the other side of the fence, perhaps a right of centre leaning Republican, who might argue that actually Machiavelli would be a massive fan of Donald Trump because he is cutting through the bullshit, he's cutting through the bureaucracy, he is doing things to generate the change that is required, and actually you're allowed to piss people off, you're allowed to break the rules, you're allowed to change the system in order to create the better conditions at the end of it. And that is virtuous. So I think It really depends whether Machiavelli was a Democrat or a Republican.
Okay, that has to be. We're going to scratch the word Trump from this episode, and we're going to replace the clickbait title as was Machiavelli a Democrat or Republican. That's brilliant. I think that was really very, very well said. And maybe the answer for us is we'll have to think about this in 20 years, because
Yeah.
the problem is someone will say this will lead us to disaster, another person will say this will lead us to victory. The right now, literally today, as we are recording this, it is he called it Independence Day? Or it's a special day where Donald Trump is going to put tariffs on all these countries. And there are a number of people who say this will lead to catastrophe because it makes the American citizen pay more and it breaks down the interconnected nature of the world. And there are other people who would say this is fantastic because the virtuous outcome is that the United States will become self-reliant. It will not need to rely on China for making cheap things. So there's two interesting points there. The first one is actually when you're this close to it, it is very, very difficult to call, even though there are people who will be delighted to tell you definitively the answer must be X, and another group says Y. It's very, very difficult. I think the challenge is, again, this comes back to leadership, which is he has got a group of people who are cheering for this. I think there's another group of people who are starting to go, wait a minute, what do you mean my car is going to be $4,000 more expensive? But fascinating. Okay, well, look, thank you for I think that was I didn't think we would start with Machiavelli and Clausewitz. By the way, if you haven't listened to our Machiavelli and Clausewitz influencers episodes, you should definitely go back and listen to them because it is fascinating, both of those, and highly relevant when you think about people like Donald Trump and indeed other people who are influencers. I promised we would talk about brand and side ventures. He has fingers in more pies than you can imagine, and I would imagine there is a Trump pie that is branded that way. The Trump Organization has a history of licensing the Trump name for consumer products and services. Think about that. How many global leaders do you know who license their own brand? The John Major knife and fork, the Margaret Thatcher handbag? No. This is quite unique. I don't know of anyone who has proactively, before, during, and after their presidency, branded themselves.
There's two ways of looking at that. So one is this is corruption. This is abuse of power. And I think there's a relatively logical argument to justify that position. I think you could equally look at this as why the hell not?
I think there'd be people who say, well, if you're a loser enough not to take advantage of this, don't blame us.
Yeah. And again, because it undermines our norms, because it's not what people have done in the past, I think there is a sort of default to it feels very wrong. If you are a fan of radical change, then actually it probably feels quite exciting. And you say, hey, you know what? This is leading by example. This is putting Donald Trump first, but it's a metaphor for putting America first. And you could argue that. I think personally, I struggle with that because I know this is not necessarily just about making a quick buck on the side. This is also a conflict of interest, and it undermines your decision-making ability and your decision-making credibility when making very, very important decisions. Ultimately, it could end up costing people money or costing people their lives. And so there is a very important precedent that has been set, which is when you are in a position of political power, you have to divest investments or you have to put them into blind trust so other people will manage them on your behalf so that you are not influenced into making decisions for your own personal benefit or for the benefit of friends, associates, people that can do you favors. And I think you're in very, very dodgy ground, even if you're not doing that. Perhaps Donald Trump has this amazing ability to separate out
I
what's
don't.
in the interest of the country and what's in the interest of, but whether or not he does, and I don't believe anybody actually has that ability, the perception of it in its own right is something that undermines the credibility of the position that he's in.
We've done this now a number of times, which is it all depends on which side you stand and what you want. I think Donald Trump would say, if I'm president and I can't make money while I'm doing so, I'm a loser. I'm going to make money. And there's a group of people going, yeah, actually, I don't see why he shouldn't make money. He's the president, you know. It all depends where you stand. There is here's a different point about this though. We can talk about two sides of this coin. Here is a behavior that Donald Trump or any influencer has. And as we've done today and in the last episode, we talk about, well, if you wear this colored hat, this is a dreadful thing. And if you wear this colored hat, this is a great thing. What is it that, and let's call Donald Trump norm breaker, what is it that makes people comfortable enough with the norm breaking? So to your point, historically, for hundreds of years, arguably, in general terms, the president has had to say the interests of the country come before my own interests. And so they do all these things. And in this case, we're seeing a president saying, no, I'm not going to have a blind trust because trust me, I'll be fine. Why is it that people accept what otherwise, and in fact, in the past, even the Republicans have said we cannot do this? And I think that is a really interesting question. It's like something has to be so special about what he's offering that people are willing to reject what had previously been accepted as truth. And I think they are willing to take that risk, whether they think it's a risk or not, is because Donald Trump is different. Donald Trump ran his political campaign as being different. He would drain the swamp. He was not like the others. And I think in politics, and again, I'm 53, and so I've seen politics over the years, what we are seeing more and more are people saying, my perception is the politics is not working for me. So this I am different is so strong and powerful. I think what we're seeing is people who 10 years ago, 20 years ago would have said, the Russians are clearly not our friends. Demonstrably, we will never trust Russians in favor of our allies. And now in 2025, a significant group of people in the United States say, and that even on camera, they're quite amusing, I trust Vladimir Putin more than I trust the United Kingdom or whatever. That, you and I both would say that's unbelievable, outrageous, and terrible. No, the more interesting thing to talk about is this lure of the different is so incredibly powerful. It is making people flip 180 degrees and be cheerful and excited at the same time. So that difference is something I think we need to pick up on, which is I'm in a business, and you actually let's talk about businesses. You often see a CEO being removed, and you say, why are you removing that CEO? Are they incompetent? Nope, they're very competent. Why are you replacing them then? We need someone new. We need something different. And that sense of difference and novelty is so powerful. Now, notionally at some point that wears off, and it turns out you weren't as different as we thought. And it turns out the things we were willing to give up on, maybe they weren't as unimportant as we thought they were. Maybe they're, but I think that's something which Donald Trump has done astoundingly well. He is difference.
Yeah, I think you're entirely right. I think he is an anti-establishment figure in a current political climate where there is a lot of anger. And whether it's deliberate or whether it's luck, he has tapped into a feeling of disenfranchisement and anger and hopelessness that has led to people saying, I don't mind the rough around the edges bits. I don't mind the criminality or the moral ambiguity or the making a quick buck on the side kind of stuff that breaks the norms, because ultimately it's going to make my life better. And we've got to be careful here because about half the country actually don't like it. America hasn't all fallen in line behind Donald Trump. It is a very polarized, very split nation. But for those that have, for those that do vote, they all vote for slightly different reasons. They all have a different socio-economic background, different perceptions of what's important. But the thing that brings them together is their frustration and their need for change.
I think that's something that we can, we said, how do you take something good from this? What our views are on this. But I think that's a really good example. There are opportunities. Again, let's play this in reverse. How do you get people to take global warming seriously? If Donald Trump was Greta Thunberg, the United States would be heading towards net zero quicker than you can believe. And people would say, I am suffering today, but I'm suffering for good reasons. That's interesting. Okay, I'm not going to be put off now. We've gone through about 10% of my notes, and I think I committed in the next 10 minutes, I'll get through the next 90%. So I'm going to trot through. Side ventures, Donald Trump has a number. This isn't adding to anything, more just my amusement. 1970, he invested $70,000 to receive billing as a co-producer of Broadway comedy. Purchased the New Jersey Generals, a team in the US Football League. He lent his name to the Tour de Trump, which was an attempt to create an American equivalent of the Tour de France. He purchased Eastern Airlines shuttle, financing the purchase.
Jump in
Yeah,
and
go
make
for
a
it.
point that I don't think people make enough, and that is we have to give credit to the guy in terms of how successful he's been building a brand when your second name is a synonym for fart.
Yes, yes.
Poor Trump.
And by the way, you ruined my whole serious thing there. But your more serious part of that is he has, and each one of these things at the beginning, look how successful we are. He purchased Miss Universe, including Miss USA
Yes.
and Miss Teen USA. He opened the Donald J. Trump Foundation. He gave the foundation 5.4 million, which had been spent by the end of 2006. And after donating a total of $65,000 in 2007, 2008, he stopped donating any personal funds to charity because he's not a charity. The charity, by the way, then committed a number of potential legal and ethical violations, including self-dealing and tax evasion. In 2018, the foundation ceased operation and dispersed its assets to other charities. And in 2019, a New York state judge ordered Trump to pay $2 million to a group of charities for misusing the foundation's funds, get this, in part to finance his presidential campaign. Massive media
I
career.
am not surprised.
No? How many books has he written? Brackets, not written.
Well, I mean, famously, The Art of the Deal,
The Art of the Deal.
which I don't think he's even read, let alone written.
Yes. Which, if you're a Trump supporter, why would he read it? Need to.
Yeah.
19 books.
19.
Interestingly, it is said, which is a great Trumpism, by the way, he acquired his style of politics from professional wrestling with its staged fights. And an author, Naomi Klein, writes that he's a member of the WWE Hall of Fame for his performance as himself, brackets, the ultra-rich boss, in the world wrestling entertainment world. And then, of course, he was a television star in The Apprentice from 2004 to 2015. Personal opinion, not that the rest of this podcast isn't personal opinion. I think The Apprentice sealed the deal for him to be the president. Because I think from 2004 to 2015, nightly or weekly on primetime US TV, he was portrayed as the greatest businessman in America, and he hired and fired people. That, I think, is the jewel in his crown about his brand. Okay, let's move on.
I think you're entirely right.
And
I think
and may God have mercy on our soul, but that is how we decide who are presidents and who are not presidents. And just before, by the way, that I sound like I'm smug about this, Volodymyr Zelensky, um, how did he become president, Gareth?
he played an accidental president, a school teacher who gets accidentally promoted to president after a YouTube clip goes viral or a Telegram clip goes viral, and then becomes an advocate fighting against corruption at a time where Ukraine was really struggling to fight against corruption. So, yeah, I think that there are lots of examples here of where being in the public eye and having a narrative around you is so important to influence. And we talked about it when we talked about Taylor Swift, and we talked about the growing role of influence through media, social media, being part of what makes you an influencer. So in Taylor Swift's case, incredible musician. So there's a sort of story of talent. And she, we talked about the fact that she portrays herself as, the typical American young woman who's trying to make her way in the world, cardigan wearing, all of that stuff that we talked about. If you haven't listened to it, really interesting episode and surprising insights, I think. Self-serving there a little bit,
Well,
but
it was interesting for us to go, oh, we hadn't
yeah.
thought of that. That's really interesting.
But I think it's really important, and you're right. Where the narrative for Taylor Swift is her musical talent and her sort of she's a typical middle America kind of young woman making her way in the world, and everybody from her demographic can sort of latch onto that. Donald Trump's narrative is, I'm a brilliant business deal maker. I'm hard nosed. I don't suffer fools gladly. I know instinctively what's right. And those are all the things that we look for in leaders.
And I think it, by the way, just to be clear, I think it was also more than that, but it was a big part of it. Well, look, let's get on to the politics. Not a trick question, Gareth. Which political party is Donald Trump affiliated with?
Well, he's currently affiliated with the Republican Party.
Let's just wind that question back. Trump registered as a Republican in 1987, so you are absolutely right. He then joined the Independence Party, which was
he's good as an independent, didn't he?
An affiliate of the Reform Party in 1999. Then he was a Democrat in 2001, and then he was a Republican in 2009. And then in 2011, he was unaffiliated, and in 2012, he was a Republican. Look, for those people would say there are lots of good reasons, and many politicians, I think Winston Churchill being one of them, who have moved parties. That's true. And it's plausible that there is excellent reason why he moved. His beliefs changed and grew. But it is also just as possible he just wants to go where the power is. And he thought, this is where the power is, and I will go there. Now, that's actually, even the tone in which I said that was disparaging. Again, let's play the game. There's another tone which says, he went where the power was, and that's why he's so successful. So we have to be there.
Yeah. And I think, don't be on the losing team is an interesting avenue to explore of it. Does that define where success is? And of course, when you're talking about making money, then actually that's probably a very appropriate kind of place to be. You don't want to invest in losing organizations that are going to become worthless and you're going to lose your money. But of course, life isn't just about making money and scoring points. It's about making the world a better place. It's about having an ideological standpoint on things that you care about. And perhaps that's where, for the most of us that do have strong ideological positions, we find it so difficult. We find it so difficult to reconcile the fact that he is chasing success, not because he wants to make the world a better place and he wants to make a difference, or not because he is so aghast at, the state of politics, no matter what he says. It's because it is for him about the success. I think.
I think you're absolutely right. And You said something there which is so important for us to understand. Many people have a set of values which make us real and say, how could a person be like this? I do firmly believe that, but that just presumes you have a specific set of values. If you have different values, he is incredibly admirable because he follows a particular path. It happens we don't agree with that for the reasons you've outlined, but that's interesting. Let's talk for a second. I was going to talk about the run up to the 2016 election, but I am going to do that, but I'm going to spin it around a bit. One of the things that's really interesting about any of our influencers is how do you measure their success? A different way of saying it is Donald Trump effective? You have to debate what you mean by effective, but let's talk about this by the things that he ran on in his campaign. In 2016, first of all, just for giggles, he said he twice refused to say whether he would accept the result of the election. This was in the presidential debates. He described NATO as obsolete. He emphasized renegotiating US-China relations and free trade agreements. He was going to strongly enforce immigration laws. He was going to ban immigrants or people from Muslim majority countries, pursue energy independence, oppose climate change, modernizing services for veterans, repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, abolish common core education standards, invest in infrastructure, simplify the tax code, impose tariffs, increase military spending, deport millions of immigrants. I think if you look at that, actually, mostly in the first presidency, he was pretty unsuccessful. He didn't do half of those things. He talked a lot about them. The immigrant ban from Muslim majority countries, that lasted for days before it was stopped. He did not simplify the tax code. He did not invest in infrastructure in any meaningful way. He did not abolish common core education standards. So interesting, again, on the face of it, actually very unsuccessful in his first presidency in terms of the things he ran on. And yet, doesn't matter, he was voted in again. And just to make our point, we're talking about success and failure. He was the fifth person to be elected president despite losing the popular vote. He actually received nearly 2.9 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. He received 46.3% of the nation's votes compared to a 48.25. So again, you could look at this two ways. Actually, he was less successful than he made out. Another way of saying it was he didn't care. He got past the line and he won.
You say he didn't care. He absolutely cared. He absolutely cared and refutes to this day that he lost the popular vote.
Yeah.
In the first election, clearly refutes absolutely that he lost to Joe Biden at all. And even, demonstrable lies about the size of the crowd at the inauguration. These are things he does deeply care about because they are reflections of him and his success. And I think that gives us an insight into, does Donald Trump, does he really care about the lives of poor working class people across the Midwest? Well, we can't go inside Donald Trump's mind, but as a proxy, he didn't really care about the poor working class people of downtown Harlem in the 1970s. So why would he suddenly care about people in the Midwest? I don't think he does. Does he care about the size of the crowd at his inauguration? Yeah, because that's a reflection on him and his success. And he judges everything on how much money he's got and how people view him and I think he's a deeply insecure person who needs this verification of his own success constantly. He needs people to tell him how good he is. And every time somebody says he's not good, he just dismisses it as that's patently not true. And then he'll make up a lie about how good he is in that respect and prove that he is, even if it is a verifiable fact. And that's the trait of, an absolute narcissist, which we know is part of the dark triad.
Yeah.
We know it is part of toxic leadership. And we've talked before, we did a whole episode on toxic leadership. If being toxic still gets stuff done, then is it toxic? And I think we came to a conclusion in that episode where we said, ultimately, it depends on the time frame on which you judge success. And sometimes you need to be or have characteristics or traits of toxicity to just push through the friction of wherever you're at. But ultimately, doing that in the long term is going to harm the system more than the benefits of getting a quick win.
It leads us back to that sort of ultimate question, and maybe we'll come back to this at the very end of the episode, which is Donald Trump going to leave the United States in a better place than he found it? And we might have opinions, but we'll need to go ahead 20 years. Just before we go to the break, I've trotted through my notes, and at some point I gave up and I wrote the phrase, we could also talk about. And so I'm going to go through, I think it's 10 or 12 bullet points, maybe more, of all the things that we're not going to cover, but just to remind people about there's so much there. Conspiracy theories. Remember Obamagate, that he wasn't really born in America? The dubious pardons at the end of his presidency. The very fine people on both sides comment at the 2017 Unite the Right rally, condemning this, quote, egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides, the protesters. In January 2018, the discussion of immigration legislation, where he reportedly, but I think repeatedly as well, referred to El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, and African nations as, quote, shithole countries. 2019, he tweeted that 4 Democratic congresswomen, all minorities, 3 of whom are native-born Americans, should, quote, go back to the countries they came from, just in case you're wondering about the racism thing. In January 2017, he signed an executive order that denied entry to citizens of 7 Muslim-majority countries. He criticized NATO allies and privately suggested that the US should withdraw from NATO. He began a trade war with China in 2018. By the end of his first year in office, 34% of his original staff had resigned, been fired, or reassigned. His Supreme Court appointments that politically shifted the court to the right, 2 impeachments. One arose from whistleblower complaint that in 2019 Trump had pressured Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to investigate Joe and Hunter Biden. And the second one was that the finding votes one? You need to find some more votes? I can't remember. Lies and lying, his false and misleading statements that were documented by fact checkers, including the Washington Post, which, sometimes you have to take a step back because it's so easy to sort of get caught up in the, well, he didn't say shithole countries or he got all these things. There's lots of opportunity, which of course his supporters do, to explain why these aren't bad things. The Washington Post tallied 30,573 false or misleading statements made by him during his first presidency. Not just the odd lie, 30,000 lies.
I've just cheated and Googled the second impeachment. It was actually for the incitement of the January the 6th riots at Capitol Hill. But the fact that we couldn't remember that, I think, speaks to the fact that there is so much going on here that things that individually would be the downfall of a previous administration, things that individually would be the end of a political or business career for most people, just become part of the background noise with this guy.
We'll take a break in a second, but maybe we'll come back and talk about flooding the zone, because I think that's a really interesting, and I tend to suspect very, very, very conscious strategy. Anyway, great news. I got through about 50% of my notes. Bad news. I'm just going to throw the rest away because, we've heard it before. I think we've made our points. Let's come back straight after the break and let's start digging on a couple of those other topics: loyalty, communication, shaping the narratives, all the flooding the zone, the chief spaghetti throw, all these kinds of things. So we'll be back in 30 seconds, and I promise we will then finish off this influencer's set of 2 episodes around Donald Trump. Welcome back, everyone. We're on the home straight. I know that this is quite a stressful topic for everyone. Honestly, perhaps whichever side you're on the of this particular discussion. But as we do sort of look to the last 30 minutes, I can tell you of all the influencers we've talked about, maybe it's because of the proximity to this time and this engagement. This is a man who has influenced more than I can almost describe. And I'm fascinated. I'd love to go 100 years into the future and look at what the history books say. But anyway, let's go back. We finished the last part of the episode, just before we went on the break. We talked about flooding the zone. We should talk about that. I think so. Flooding the zone, meaning there's so much stuff going on. One of those things, if it happened to someone else, would be their downfall. But with so many things, it's hard to keep up. So this week was, as you discussed either earlier in this episode or the last episode, the Telegram channel talking about military secrets with a journalist. I'm pretty sure in 2 weeks' time we'll have forgotten this and moved on to something else. When, frankly, that could easily have brought any normal government down.
You're right. And for me, I think there's two interesting aspects to this. One is this just chaotic administration doing so much stuff that is unconventional that it's hard to keep track? Or is there a more malign aspect to this, which is, and maybe there's another point as well, actually, but is this a malign administration that is throwing headline grabbing stuff out there so that we all get really annoyed and excited about whatever gaffe somebody has made, or whatever controversial statement has been made, or whatever executive order has just been signed, that we all get very excited about, in order to allow them to do fundamental changes to the system in ways that are far less interesting and far more nuanced. And it comes down to, we haven't mentioned it in either of the two episodes so far, this idea of Project 2025. Was Donald Trump, and I don't for a minute believe that Donald Trump is some sort of puppet being run from deeper villains in the shadows. I think Donald Trump is absolutely in charge, but we know that Donald Trump is focused on Donald Trump, and there are people in the administration that are able to get movement in directions politically that align to their ideology. Is there a deliberate strategy here of changing the system in a way that most people don't necessarily recognize or understand? It's difficult to explain. And at the same time, it's really easy to talk about how an executive order has just been signed that's going to cancel all of USAID.
I think the answer is less interesting than we might hope. I think, your statement just now, is this an incredibly clever strategy to distract people while things are? I think the answer is it's all of the things you've said and a bunch of other things. So do I think there is, this will get me thrown out of the country, do I think there is general incompetence in the current Trump government? Yes, I absolutely do. I think they have hired a number of people who are simply not competent for the role. And this will get me in massive trouble. Sorry, let me get this straight. Your Secretary of Defense was a pundit on Fox News. Righto. That seems so. I think there is a level of incompetence which generates news and cycles and angst. I think there is also a number of people who sit there and say, I'm not as stupid as some of those other people. I am quite happy to use this to quietly go and do things. I also think, it was, as you were talking about Project 2025, I suspect this is all guesswork, but Donald Trump, obviously didn't read Project 2025. I think it's 900 pages. But I think he probably said, I agree with some of the things at high level. I don't like immigration. I think he's quite happy to allow it as long as it broadly aligns with what he wants. And I think he probably throws in a bit of personal annoyance. In other words, I think he probably does think Muslims are bad. And so when there's an opportunity to say, I'm going to disadvantage people like that, sure, he'll put it and do it. Not because it's a strategy, not because he's deeply evil, but because I've got the opportunity and I'm the president. And by the way, nobody stopped me. And just to go back to the point about why I think it's lots of these things, there's lots of things being talked about at the moment. And actually, we talk quite a lot about this week that there is that the classified information was shared with the wrong person. I actually don't think that's the most important news story of the last 2 weeks. I think the most important news story of the last 2 weeks is, and I haven't tallied this up, but I think it's fair to say the federal government has laid off at least 50,000 employees in the last 2 weeks. They have closed down USAID, as you've said. They are cutting the health services department by, I think, 20,000. They have cut the Veterans Administration by 10,000, whatever the number is. I think that is the insidious, dangerous. There are things that they are doing now that will literally take decades to fix. Now, the statement fix implies they weren't bad things and they were good. And by the way, the people doing it, I am very confident, have a genuine belief that we need a smaller government, that we need to cut this waste, we need to decrease the debt. There's all good reasons why they're doing that. Do they really understand how all this works? Or was this a great hypothetical school debating society? We need a smaller country and you've got rid of these people. I think as an example, that's going on. So all of the things you have just said and probably a bunch more are happening. And I think Donald Trump is sitting there going, I don't really care. As long as I can, when I say I want to do a thing and I'm allowed to do it, I'm going to go ahead and do it.
Writer, journalist Michael Wolff, who inexplicably was allowed to embed himself into the White House in the first administration on a podcast. I think it was the leading podcast of The Rest is Politics, was talking about the fact that actually it's not that Donald Trump, I don't think he doesn't care. I think it generates headlines, it generates media attention. People are talking about Donald Trump. And the point he made is, what's the logical conclusion to that? You have to keep getting bigger. You have to get bolder. You have to, because people become inoculated to this. A few years ago, we were talking about
tweeting.
He tweets, or a recording of him saying something vulgar on a bus. Horrible as it was, it's trivial now compared to the things that are now happening, that are now being done. And Michael Wolff says, what's the logical conclusion from that? Well, he's going to do something that is so bad that the whole system implodes. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's a really quite unsettling thought. But going back to this Signal chat and the issue with discussing highly classified war plans, rightly, there's a lot of discussion about how the hell was a journalist on there? Are they incompetent? Why are they discussing such classified material? But interestingly, that's distracted us from the fact that what they were discussing was bombing another country. Just for a minute, take a breath. How serious a decision is it to bomb another country? And I'm not saying whether it's the right or wrong thing to do in terms of geopolitics, strategy, the current situation with the Houthi rebels in Yemen. I'm just simply saying we're all talking about the breach of security. We're not talking about the fact that on that chat, there is a lot of conversation about bombing another country because the president said we should, and yet all of these people who are the key leaders and decision makers in the national security system of the United States are discussing with a level of confusion and different perspectives on why they're doing it, but not in a grown-up, measured conversation that you would expect to happen in a secure building. But that aside, they're talking about it in a way that is trivial, not serious, and they don't seem to recognize the gravity of what they're actually discussing, and nor do we, because we're all now talking about the incompetence and not the fact that they bombed another country, not as part of a geostrategic strategy, but because the president said they should. And the conversation is really, really childish and naive.
Well, there was just to punctuate what you just said, there was another part of the chat which was particularly interesting, which was as part of that chat, they discussed targeting a member of the Houthi government or military. And in it, they excitedly, sorry, that's an emotional statement, excitedly, but they talked about the fact that they had intelligence that he had entered a particular building and that building had been flattened. And going back to your point, what they didn't say was, have we discussed the collateral damage? Will innocent people die? The answer was, he's a bad guy. We have the right to just flatten the building because that's how we're going to do it. That, I think that's important. Let's go to something else, because you've kind of touched on this, which is his team. And actually, we talked about this before, which is, I would argue his team is interesting. In his first presidency, he almost was forced to pick some grown-ups, people who had experience and who seemed to be serving out of a sense of duty. In fact, there were many people, Rex Tillerson, who almost implied, we don't agree with President Trump, but we were there because we serve our country more than we serve a president. I would
General
argue,
Mattis, John Bolton.
yeah.
You know, interestingly, I deeply respect General Mattis, a US Marine, and therefore, there's an affiliation between the Royal Marines. He's a serving general, or was a serving general. So there's a lot of overlap with my world there. Very, very respected, very capable, and I generally agree with his sentiments and ideology. A grown up. John Bolton, somebody who I fundamentally disagree with on a lot of political issues, but absolutely recognise he's a competent, capable operator, is a grown up. And that's okay, because that's the point in politics. You don't agree with everybody, you have different views. I agree with you. I think there were lots of people there who almost restraining the erraticism and the narcissism of the president, whereas that doesn't feel like the case this time.
Well, he's fixed it, to use the term. He now values loyalty and fealty to anything else. And so I think there's a really interesting question there, which is, in the short term, that is a successful strategy. He has said, who will serve me unquestioningly? And the early part of his second presidency implies that that's successful. People are supporting him. But interestingly, is that going to continue? Will that be a winning strategy as we go on? So very interesting. I will burn in hell for this. It feels like there are people who are willing to abandon a set of values to get what they want, and what they want is power. Let's change, though, to another one, which is, we've been tried to be good for an episode and a half, and I suspect we'll slip. Cult of personality. I think, given what we have discussed, for people to so clearly reverse many positions they had held strongly so recently, and I'll repeat the Russian one, the idea that the Republican Party now trusts Russia more than Ukraine, or more interestingly, Canada,
or Denmark.
How weird is that? Or Denmark?
Yeah.
That implies some sort of cult of personality, I think, which is, we can be disappointed and sad about that. But again, there is a lesson to take away. How do you get people to follow you? And maybe an unanswered question, how do you ensure that a large group of people do not fall under the sway of this kind of cult of personality. He is an
Yeah.
incredible conspiracy theorist. That's amazing, and people follow him. And this was quote from Rubio again, Marco Rubio, who's the current Secretary of State. Quote, he is a con artist. This is the current Secretary of State in the United States. Donald Trump is a con artist. He runs on this idea that he is fighting for the little guy, but he has spent his entire career sticking it to the little guy. His entire career. Okay, now you can say, Marco Rubio, but he is a fabulous example of that is about as much of a flip-flop as you can get. And Marco Rubio is not unique in this. What is it that Donald Trump does to cause people to switch views like this? That is incredible.
It is. And I think we've, or certainly I, over the last 20 minutes or so, have probably failed in my objective to try and be balanced and fair and not allow my bias. Let me use this opportunity to not defend Trump, but to just point out that that is not Trump's problem. That is the individuals who are hypocritical, who value association to the power more than their own integrity. That isn't a Trump problem, that's a them problem. And I think history will judge them accordingly. It's really
but
interesting.
he's a smart person to make the most of that, though.
Yeah. And I think, again, if we looked at that objectively, we would say that is really good leadership. If you can get people to fall in line and agree with you when not that long ago they were vehemently opposed, not just to your policies and your ideas, but to you as a person, then my God, you have some influence. And I think that says something a little bit depressing about the current state of US, but largely global politics. The problem that we have is we don't have enough people that will stand up for what they believe in as right. And if you look at the Republican Party, there was it Jill Cheney?
I can't
Daughter of
remember
Dick
if,
Cheney?
yeah.
But the one senator who doggedly stuck to her line that this is not acceptable. And she was stripped from her position, not sacked, but the Trump administration made sure that there were other candidates that stood and that the Trump base voted for them instead. So she lost her position. Now, if more people had done that, they wouldn't have had the power to do it. And so this is I think it's a stain on the history of the US political system that not enough people stood up for what they believed in at a time where it was pretty crucial. But that again is not a slight on Trump. That is a slight on the system around Trump, allowing him to get away with what objectively you would say is really, really powerful and strong leadership.
I wonder whether we're coming to the end. I've got two more points that I want to very briefly make before we finish. And many people will say, thank God for that, who are still with us. But I do this slightly tongue in cheek. Maybe this episode has just proved the whole point of why we do this podcast. Good, strong leadership is critical. One might say it wasn't Donald Trump's brilliance that won. It was the failure of people around him to prevent him doing the things that we might disagree with. And sort of flipped on its head, the reason why Donald Trump was successful was because others were unsuccessful in demonstrating a more compelling leadership. And he has skills which he knows how to use, inherently or otherwise. And I will burn in hell for this. He is a better leader than anyone else that was up against him. There you go. That's a dreadful thing to say, but he is a better leader. He was more successful. More people voted for him than voted for Kamala Harris. And we can talk for
Yeah, yeah.
months about why that she wasn't the best or what she did wrong, what she did right. That is irrelevant. He was a more successful influencer and leader. And the last 2 points I'll raise just to finish this off is his communication skills. And we've kind of bounced across those, but I think that's another one of those fundamental reasons why he is where he is. He is a social media master. If you are inclined to like him, you love him. He is going to give you your endorphin rush if you vaguely either agree with him or agree with the things he does.
That's a really important point, because we often talk about the fact that, his supporters soak it all up, and the cult of personality. But of course, his detractors soak it all up. The media soaks it all up. Part of the brilliance of Donald Trump's media profile, part of the brilliance of the strategy of narcissism, is that we're doing a podcast. We've done a double episode on Donald Trump. This is a podcast where we explore ideas around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership. And we've done a double episode on a guy that I think, it's pretty obvious by this point, can't stand. We disagree fundamentally with a lot of his ideological positions. You've just said he's a better leader than anybody else. I don't agree. But I think through a very narrow lens, you could say it doesn't matter that he's a pretty shocking leader in a lot of attributes, because ultimately what matters is he won the election. And if that is your metric, he is a better leader. And I think you're right to point out that there was nobody else capable of standing against him, either from the Republican Party or from the Democrat Party. And I think one of the things we haven't really touched upon in these last two episodes, largely because it's about Donald Trump, not about American politics, is the failure of the left to have a coherent message, and the failure of the left to, we said earlier, I think I said, it might have been in the last episode, that whilst Donald Trump supporters come from a very diverse group of backgrounds and socio-economic positions, and yet we all assume they were white men, and we know that's not true. We know there's a much, much broader set of support. Nearly half the voting population voted for him. But the thing that they have in common is disenfranchisement, frustration, and anger. That was galvanized, that was pulled together, that was a force, a coherent force for change. The failure on the left, the failure of the Democrats, was to not bring together a diverse group of people who have very extreme differences in opinions, very different views on different aspects of culture and society. And actually, there is nobody who has done what Donald Trump did on the left to bring people together. And arguably, the leaders we've seen on the left in recent times have actually disenfranchised fairly large groups of people and pushed them away. And I think there's lessons to be learnt there. That's perhaps for another episode. There is brilliance, albeit, and I say this,
I could see you gritting your teeth as you're saying these words.
I'm uncomfortable saying it, but there is brilliance in what he does for achieving what he wants to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's a good place for us to sort of come to the end. Partly because I'd quite like to stay in the United States for another few days before I get thrown out. But I think maybe to summarize, love him or hate him, Donald Trump is an incredibly important influencer. Love him or hate him, there are hundreds of lessons that can be learnt for good and for bad. Whether you support or don't support him, you can both cheer for things he does and you can wave your fist at things he does. We should take a moment, if you are interested in the business of leadership, to think about these things, to think about all these concepts and topics we have talked about, communication, loyalty, strategy, the people around you, flooding the zone, not stupid, cult of personality. These are all things which we've talked about Donald Trump like he affects me on a day-to-day basis, when to some degree he doesn't. But the lessons that we pull from these, we absolutely can apply on a day-to-day basis. This is something when I've done sort of coaching with people and mentoring, and I've talked about what kind of leader do you want to be. Donald Trump is an amazing case of one of those leaders where you can either write down the things he does that you like and you wish to explore, emulate, grow, or you could write down things that make your blood boil and you say, I will never do those things, I wish to do others. I really do walk away from this, as you say, a brilliant influencer through the lens we have discussed. It doesn't change my opinion of what he's doing and whether, in fact, to put my cards on the table, I think he will leave the United States poorer when he leaves the presidency than when he started. And I think we won't be able to prove that or know that for many years. But what an influencer. And perhaps of all the influencers we have done, the most visceral, the most sort of real, the most important, the most complicated, and the most relevant of all the influencers we have ever done.
I quite agree. I think you're right to talk about, 20 years hence is when we'll have a real sense of effectiveness. But I'm going to make this bet now. History will not judge Donald Trump well. He will be remembered. He will not be forgotten. He is one of the most controversial and charismatic and interesting world leaders ever. But history will judge him. And I think for the simple reason that he does things that are not in the interest of the nation. He does things that are in the interest of him. And whether that sometimes aligns, and sometimes there are things that happen that he does that end up being really positive. And we haven't necessarily talked about those things. The Abraham Accords in the first term, actually, I think, were a very well executed process to drive real positive change in the Middle East. Undermined, of course, by current ideas around turning Gaza into some sort of holiday destination by ethnically cleansing all of the Gazans. But let's not get into that.
Look, you can't be perfect.
You can't be perfect. But I think what will happen, and what is almost inevitable, is that history will judge him on the fact that he has abused people, abused positions, abused systems, abused power consistently. And I think this comes back to the point you made at the very beginning of the first episode. He is more consistent than we think, but not necessarily for the right reasons. And I think he will leave America in a worse place. But worse than that, for him, his legacy will be a black mark on the history of the US.
I think if we hadn't placed our marker on the table before, we have now. Thank you for listening to these two influencer episodes. And whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, I hope you found that interesting, challenging, and I hope you, at the very least, appreciated our attempt to remain unbiased, or at least if we're biased, acknowledging it very clearly and acknowledging things that Trump does well as the things we don't agree with. And I think there's probably more conversations, as you said, about political leadership that we can talk about as well in the future. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking with us. We'd like to apologize if anyone is incredibly offended by us. Hopefully there's not too many of those. If you have stuck with us over the two episodes and you have not subscribed before, but you clicked on the download because it said something about Donald Trump and we want to read about that, please go back and listen to other episodes, whether it be the influencer episodes or just the general battling with business. This really is our attempt to better understand how to lead, how to build great teams, how to grow, how to be successful. We've got lots. We talked in an earlier episode about Clausewitz and in fact, the beginning of this episode is Clausewitz and Machiavelli. Go back and listen to those episodes as well as all the others. And please subscribe. Please share with your friends and say they had a really interesting conversation. Go listen to it. It's stimulating. Follow us on Twitter. See, we call it Twitter rather than X here because we're rebels. We are Battling with Biz. We are on Blue Sky as well, Battling with Biz as well. We are also available on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. If you are seething with our discussion, email us and tell us why. If you are thrilled with what we've discussed and it's illuminated the matter for you, tell us as well. If you think we should be doing some other influencers, we would love to hear who those influencers are that perhaps we haven't heard of before, or if you've got other ideas for topics that we should cover, dive in, and frankly argue with each other about, please let us know as well. But for now, I think it's time for me to pop to the bar in Santa Fe. Gareth, don't go do any more running today, but I hope you have a very pleasant evening. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you on the next episode of Battling with Business.
Thanks very much. See you later. Bye-bye.